From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Thursday, June 22nd. For nearly 50 years, women in the United States were protected by federal law from having to carry an unwanted pregnancy. They gained this right in 1973 thanks to the historic Supreme Court judgment in the Roe v. Wade case. This held until nearly a year ago, when the current Supreme Court overturned that judgment. This weekend marks the one-year anniversary of that groundbreaking decision. So, what has life in the United States been like for women since then? Today, North American correspondent Farrah Tomazin on how this decision has caused a seismic shift in American culture and its political landscape. So Farrah, it's almost exactly 1 year ago today that the American Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. So can you remind us about that decision and what people expected that it would mean at that time?
So Roe v. Wade was basically a landmark ruling made in 1973, which granted women in America the constitutional right to access abortion. It essentially stemmed from this case back in the 70s involving a Texas woman who was denied access to abortion. She launched a legal challenge. She was given the pseudonym Jane Roe to protect her identity, and Wade was the Attorney General at the time. She ended up winning that case, and the Supreme Court essentially ruled that the right to privacy, which covered things such as contraception and procreation, should also cover the right to have an abortion in America. So over the next 50 years, that ruling became a major battleground between the pro-life and pro-choice movements, and I guess a real lightning rod for religious conservatives who argued, and still do, that life begins at the point of conception and that abortion is essentially tantamount to murder. So this was a battle, as we know, that was waged all the way until June 24 of last year.
There is no other way to put it. Roe versus Wade and its progeny are dead. Women in the United States no longer have a constitutional guarantee.
A sweeping, deeply consequential decision from the nation's highest court, rocking the foundations of more than 5 decades of legal precedent in our country.
That's when the Supreme Court repealed Roe v. Wade. The Conservative justices on the 9-member court who make up the majority, they adopted a ruling, and that ruling basically said that the arguments for Roe were wrong, they were exceptionally weak, and they were so damaging that they amounted to an abuse of judicial authority. They also argued that the US Constitution doesn't prohibit the citizens of each state from regulating abortion, and therefore the state should have the authority to essentially determine whether to provide abortion services going forward, and that's essentially what's happened.
And so can you tell us a little bit about the response at the time when Roe versus Wade was overturned? Because it was quite extraordinary. There was thousands of people gathering in cities across the country, some to celebrate, the Supreme Court's decision and others to deride it. You were in the States then. So what did you see and what kind of conversations do you recall having at that time?
Yeah, it was extraordinary. I mean, even though we had a feeling that this would happen because a draft of Justice Alito's ruling had actually been leaked a month earlier via Politico, I think seeing the words on paper and having, 50 years of precedent turned on its head really did kind of shift the social and political landscape here in America. I recall within an hour of the ruling, the street outside the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. was filled with demonstrators. They were, as you say, protesting the decision. Some were celebrating it. I mean, pro-life groups were crying and dancing in the streets.
We are dancing on the grave of Roe versus Wade. It's like taking Normandy Beach, and we will get to Berlin.
Pro-choice groups were warning that it would lead to more unsafe procedures and unwanted pregnancies.
And I am absolutely terrified. I'm so beyond livid at what is going on, and I'm going to turn my fear into anger.
And, we had these so-called trigger bills in various Republican states that were going to be initiated to make abortions illegal or really hard to get in those states.
The impact of today's ruling will be immediate. 13 states have trigger laws that automatically end access to abortion now that Roe is overturned. 7 have already gone into effect.
And these were bills that were ready to go as soon as the court overturned the ruling.
We called patients. It's like, I'm already on my way. And they thought, well, I'm already on my way. It'll be okay. And it's like, no, it's immediate. It's immediate.
And they would essentially be initiated to make abortions illegal or really hard to get in those particular states and force women to travel interstate to a place where abortion remained legal in order to get the healthcare they needed. And I guess, people, they were just really scared. I mean, I remember going to Oklahoma, for instance, and people there were fearful because the government had also set up a bounty hunting scheme, encouraging members of the public to sue people involved in abortions and giving them at least $10,000 if their lawsuit was successful. I remember visiting Tennessee, where doctors were really worried because the state had made it a crime for doctors to help women terminate a pregnancy. And I remember going to Jackson, Mississippi, which you might recall was the area where the Jackson's Women's Health Organization was centred. That was the abortion clinic at the centre of the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. And I got there just before it was forced to close its doors. I remember phones at the clinic were ringing nonstop with terrified women and their partners wanting to know if they can still access the healthcare they needed. I remember meeting a 17-year-old girl who was about to start college, and she was petrified about what might happen if she accidentally got pregnant. And the owner of the Jackson Clinic was, even planning to open a new centre in New Mexico, which is about 1,800 kilometres away. But, she was saying that the surge in demand would have meant that women would be lucky to get an appointment there. And that's even if they could afford to travel all the way. So the impact of the ruling was really swift and really severe, and I think it continues to have ripple effects across the country to this day.
Right, and I want to talk to you now about what's actually happened over the last 12 months since the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade. Just how difficult has it become for women in the US to receive abortions?
Well, a lot more difficult. I mean, abortion is now banned in about 14 states across the US, and that obviously affects tens of millions of women. Missouri, I think, was the first to announce it was invoking its trigger ban after the court ruling. That was followed by bans in Arkansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. Now, abortion is banned with no exceptions for rape or incest in those states. Other states, they limit abortion to certain weeks of pregnancy. So, for example, if you're in Georgia, you can't have an abortion after 6 weeks. If you're in Nebraska, it's 12 weeks. In places like Arizona and Florida, it's 15 weeks. And there were some, really awful stories. Last year, a pregnant 10-year-old girl from Ohio, for example, she had to get an abortion in neighbouring Indiana after she was raped. In Texas, a woman in her mid-30s almost died because her doctor wouldn't perform the procedure even though she was having complications. And you might recall in Florida, there was a heartbreaking story recently of a woman who carried her baby to full term because she was denied an abortion despite her doctors knowing her child wouldn't survive. I mean, her baby was alive for 99 minutes. I mean, that's the harsh reality of all this. And then it's really exacerbated pre-existing inequalities in America. If I go back to Mississippi, for example, where the Jackson Clinic recently closed, Mississippi is like the poorest state in the union. It's got the highest black population percentage among the 50 states. So it would be really hard for people there to take off time from work or to arrange for childcare or to pay for a trip to a distant state just so that they can get the medical care they need. And this is the grim reality of life in a post-Roe world.
I mean, it's just astonishing. But it does make me wonder, have there been any surprises, I guess, in the last year? Perhaps states we anticipated would come down harshly on abortion that haven't. I'm thinking of how Michigan, for instance, since Roe versus Wade was overturned, enacted a state law that protects the right to an abortion. And I believe abortion rights activists have actually had wins in other typically Republican states too. So is there an argument to be made that the overturning of the decision has emboldened pro-rights activists and Democrats to sort of fight harder for abortion rights and turn out to the polls in greater numbers than they had before?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an argument to be made in that sense. I mean, you might recall in Kansas last year, shortly after Roe v. Wade was overturned, voters were asked in that state to vote on an amendment, which basically asked them, to amend the state's constitution to remove the right to an abortion completely in that constitution. Now, despite that state being deeply conservative, people overwhelmingly voted against that amendment, which prevented Kansas's Republican-led legislature from passing severe abortion restrictions going forward. That was a really big surprise at the time, and it really energised progressives ahead of the midterms last November. There were, as you also say, expansions of abortion rights over the past year in certain states. Michigan was one of them. I think the Guttmacher Institute found that state lawmakers across the US last year introduced, I think, 369 bills to protect access to abortion and passed 77 of them in, I think, 18 or so states. So they're pretty solid protections, and they range from increased security for abortion providers and patients. They had expanded insurance coverage for abortion services, improved access to medication abortion. And when you go in terms of like shifting sentiment, you're absolutely right. There has been a bit of a shifting sentiment. That one Gallup poll recently found that since the fall of Roe versus Wade, 69% of Americans say abortion should generally be legal in the first 8 months of a pregnancy. And that's a record high compared to previous years. So there has been this interesting shift in the dynamic.
And aren't the state laws in some sense more protective of women's rights to get an abortion than Roe v. Wade was? Because Roe v. Wade, as I understand it, had sort of a broad protection to privacy as opposed to the state laws. I think some of them actually are more specific about what reproductive rights they cover. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's what some of the bills to protect access to abortion have actually done across some of those states in terms of invoking some of those protections, as I said, whether they be increased security for abortion providers or expanded insurance and the like, or better access to medication abortion, which is a big part of sort of abortion here in the US. I mean, at the same time, the US President Joe Biden is still trying to get Congress to, enshrine federal protections into law and codify federal protections, but you're absolutely right. Some of these state-based laws do go further.
And Farrah, that brings me to my next question, which is the US presidential campaign is kicking off in a big way right now in advance of the election in November next year. So do you expect the issue of abortion to feature heavily in this race? I mean, is it still an animating issue in politics right now?
I think it's a pretty big animating issue to the extent where, last year we had the midterm elections, for example, where I think abortion, or reproductive freedom as it was couched, turned out to be part of the reason, not all, but part of the reason Joe Biden and the Democrats were able to hold off the expected Republican red wave in key battleground states. This year, we're already seeing it play out for the Republican nomination to run for the White House. So you've got Donald Trump, for example. As I mentioned, his legacy is largely, as president, about installing the conservative judges who helped repeal Roe v. Wade. You've got Florida Governor Ron DeSantis trying to get the nomination. He's, really pushing the fact that he's invoked a 15-week abortion ban in his state. You've got former Vice President Mike Pence, who's a staunch pro-lifer and an evangelical Christian, and he's really sort of, pushing that, particularly in some of those early voting states. On the other side of the coin, Democrats are really galvanised by this issue. We saw that play out in the midterms, and they're obviously keen to protect whatever rights continue to exist in the various states. I mean, this week alone, Joe Biden's doing an event with advocacy groups where he'll mark the anniversary of the repealing of Roe versus Wade and once again call on Congress to codify protections into law. You've got Kamala Harris. She's basically going to do a big speech in Charlotte, North Carolina on Saturday to make the case for national legislation to protect abortion rights. And there'll be people taking to the streets right across Washington, D.C. and other states to really, push for ongoing protections in their reproductive freedom.
And so finally, Farrah, we've, been talking largely about what's happened in the last 12 months since the Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade. But looking to the future, what do you expect in the next 12 months in a post-Roe America? What is the future of this fight? I mean, has the anti-abortion contingent won for good?
I don't think they've won for good. I mean, it was certainly a big win last year, but it will certainly be interesting to watch the issue play out. I mean, some Republicans, for example, are wanting to push for a national ban on abortion, but others strongly disagree, and they know that it's a political vulnerability for them to have candidates who are seen as too extreme on the issue. So they're really trying to work out the right balance as we go forward, particularly as we head into a election in November of next year. And it's an issue that's going to continue to play out in state legislatures and courts. I mean, even as we speak, I think there are about 40 cases that have been filed challenging abortion bans in various states, of which 29 remain pending either at trial or on appeal. So it is still a galvanising issue, and I think it will continue to be in some form or another all the way to the November 2024 presidential election.
Thank you, Farrah, for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Margaret Gordon. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.